My son and daughter back in Maryland are almost of an age now where they don't really have much interest in spending time with their parents, but they're still young enough so that we can, they'll sit and listen to our stories, especially when we're like on a long car ride and the batteries in their iPods wear out, they have nothing else to do, so they'll listen to us. So I might tell the story about my great-grandfather. He dropped out of MIT to go searching for gold in Mexico, which is how my side of the family ended up on the west coast of the United States. Or my wife might talk about how her great-grandfather immigrated to Palestine at the turn of the century, when the idea of forming the state of Israel was just a complete fantasy. But of course, you know, the stories that they really want to hear us tell are the ones that make their parents out to be complete idiots. They always seem to take much more pleasure in that. So my wife will tell a story about the time that she got her braces off when she was 13 years old, and she wanted to go show her friend how straight her teeth were. So she jumped on her bike and rode about a half a mile, flipped over the handlebars, and knocked out her two front teeth. And I remember, and the way she always tells the story is that, and my dad's first words were, "All that money wasted." Or another story they liked is the day that I decided that sailing looked pretty easy. You know, you see these people out on these sailboats, and I thought, but it can't be anything too complicated about that. So I rented one of those little sunfish sailboats and headed out into Long Island Sound. Well, what I discovered is that sailing downwind is really quite easy. It's the sailing back upwind part that it turned out I didn't quite have a grasp on. But my wife sent the Coast Guard after me, so that was okay. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to tell some stories, and they're stories about where I came from, and by implication where all of you came from. But they're stories that come from an unusual place. They're stories that are written in our DNA, in these extremely small molecules that are inside our cells. So human cells are incredibly small things, and the DNA inside them is even smaller. So with the slide right here, if you imagine that this black dot is a period at the end of a sentence on a printed page. So a period is about a half a millimeter across. So this white oval in the middle of this dot would be about the size of a typical human cell that was positioned on that period. And the DNA in that cell resides, let me get this set up. It resides in a much even smaller compartment, just about this size. I can't draw it very well, but a very small compartment inside that cell. That's how tiny these molecules are. Where these stories come from, but that's ultimately the story of the source, the origin of all the stories that I'll be telling this evening. So there are two kinds of stories I'm going to be telling. One has to do with who is descended from whom. So here's an example of that kind of story from the first few verses of the Gospel of Mark. So this records the male line of descent from Abraham to King David, though we know from the dates involved between Abraham and King David that there must be a few generations missing if this were a real genealogy. All of us have these stories of descent, though some of us know a lot more about our ancestors than do other people. But even adopted children who don't know the identities of their biological parents still know they're descended from someone, and if they choose to have their DNA analyzed, they could learn more about this. But I'm going to start with a different kind of story, and this is a story about how all people are related to each other. So if you look around at the people in this room, you'll see individuals that have a wide range of physical appearances. We have different skin colors, different facial features, different body shapes and sizes. In fact, human beings have a wider range of physical appearances than does almost any other mammalian species. The only real exceptions are species that humans have selectively bred, in part for their appearances, like dogs or livestock. So it really is true that all raccoons, for example, or all deer, look a lot more like each other than human beings do. don't know what the raccoons or the deer think about that. Maybe they think we all look alike, but nevertheless, it is true that human beings look more different than do raccoons or deer. So if you looked at the DNA of the people on this slide, or if you compared your own DNA with theirs, so that's sort of why I left this blank here, this is not a mistake. I said, imagine yourself in the middle of this slide. You might expect to find that human beings have variety in their DNA that matches the variety in their appearances. So you might expect to find that people with dark skin have very substantial genetic differences from people with light skin, or that Asian Americans are genetically very distinct part of the human species. But what you find with human beings is exactly the opposite. Genetically, human beings are remarkably alike. If you went to Africa and you looked just at the chimpanzees living in a single hillside in Africa, so like these chimps have twice as much variety in their DNA as do all of the 6 billion people living on the planet today. So 2 chimps in this diagram are much more genetically distinct than are any 2 of the individuals on this slide. By the way, I think this is kind of a good example of how species have more similar appearances than do humans. Although again, if I were a chimpanzee, maybe I would view the situation a bit differently. Certainly, people who work with chimpanzees are easily able to identify individuals. There's another very interesting way of looking at the remarkable genetic similarity of human beings. Geneticists have constructed diagrams like this, known as genetic distance diagrams. So here's a diagram that compares human beings with chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas. And you can think of an individual as sitting on the, let's see if I can get this to work here. Well, sort of out on the edges, here's one. You can think of an individual chimp as being on the very tip of this little line. And the distance of the line indicates the difference between that chimp, the genetic difference between that chimpanzee and other chimpanzees, or between these various species. So as you can see, the chimps and the gorillas in this diagram have very large genetic differences, or relatively large genetic differences from each other, whereas the humans down here on the bottom are all sort of clustered together. Even though the humans in this diagram include sub-Saharan Africans, Chinese, Native Americans, nevertheless, the genetic differences between humans are quite small compared with other species. The genetic patterns in human beings are unusual for another reason. With human beings, much of the genetic variety occurs in all human groups. Now, all human beings have the same genes, but genes come in sort of different flavors or different varieties, and that's one way you can measure the genetic difference between myself and anyone in this group, or between different groups of human beings, however you define groups. So what you find in human beings is that most of the common genetic variants are found in all human groups, and not in a single group. So here's a slide. It's a little hard to read this, but that demonstrates this point. So it compares the amount of genetic variety found within groups to the amount of variety between groups. So the larger these bars, the more different groups are from each other for these various species. So here we have humans. I'll see if I can find this. Here's humans down here. And you can see in this case that about 15% of the genetic differences divide human groups, and about 85% of the genetic differences can be found in all human groups, is essentially what this means. Up here you have different groups. A little bit higher are elephants in eastern and southern Africa. See if I can find that. That's this bar right here. In this case, almost 40% of the genetic differences separate one group from another, whereas 60% of genetic differences can be found within groups. And up at the very top you have gray wolves, again, which have just these dramatic group differences. So most conservation biologists will tell you that, as a rule of thumb, group differences have to exceed about 25 to 30% for a single species to be subdivided into subspecies or races. So by this measure, human beings do not have races. We're well below that 25 to 30% cutoff to divide our species up into these genetically distinct groups. So geneticists who have studied human genetic diversity, this very puzzling observation in human beings about our remarkable genetic similarity, say there's only one possible explanation for why human DNA could be so similar. All of us have to be descended from a relatively small group of people that lived in the relatively recent past. So at this point, you have to look at the archaeological and fossil record to try to figure out where and when this group lived. And you come up with an answer right away. Between about 200,000 and 150,000 years ago, in Eastern Africa, the first humans, who are anatomically modern, appear in the fossil record. Here's the area in Africa where that group lived, sort of where Ethiopia and Kenya and Tanzania are today. So the members of this group of humans they looked like us. They had high foreheads, sort of rounded skulls, relatively light and graceful bodies, compared with the varieties of humans that preceded them. Here's a skull this is the oldest skull that is known from a member of this group. Now there's still some archaic features in this skull. You can sort of see the brow ridges above the eyes. But essentially, these are the characteristics that all human beings have today. This skull was redated just a few months ago, actually, and is about 190,000 years old. Now, I should emphasize how recently this was in the broad sweep of human history. The first members of our genus, Homo, were Homo sapiens. The first Homos evolved about 2 million years ago, as you can see in this slide. But anatomically modern humans, who belong to our species, so Homo sapiens, didn't appear until about 200,000 years ago. So modern humans, like ourselves, have been around for only about 10% of the total expanse of human history. And to us, 150,000 years seems like quite a long time. You would think that that's plenty of time for human beings to develop genetic differences. However, as I showed in those graphs, really in evolutionary times, it's just the blink of an eye. Really hasn't given human beings time to evolve the kinds of, or develop the kinds of genetic differences that you see in other species. About 100,000 years ago, this group began to expand. First, they expanded within Africa, replacing the older varieties of humans that were living on that continent. And then, after that, they began to expand outside of Africa into Europe and Asia, where they also replaced the archaic humans, such as the Neanderthals that were living in those parts of the world. So as you can see from this map, the earliest permanent movement of modern humans out of Africa seems to have occurred about 50 to 60,000 years ago, and the first place you see modern humans outside of Africa permanently is not in the Middle East or Europe, the places that might be closest to Africa. You actually see them in northern Australia. And what we think happened is that modern humans came out of Africa sort of through the Horn of Africa and skipped along the coast, probably over the course of many, many generations or thousands of years, but eventually worked their way all the way around India and to the very tip of southeastern Asia. And one of the reasons we think that they might have been traveling at least partly over the water is that when they reached the tip of southeastern Asia, they were able to make a 60-mile crossing across open water to Australia. And the archaic humans that had been living in those regions for hundreds of thousands of years were never able to do that, but the modern humans did expand from Southeast Asia into Australia. So this was sort of the opening movement in this grand migration of modern humans out of Africa. By 30,000 years ago or 40,000 years ago, modern humans had spread into Europe and into, this map doesn't show, but they sort of expanded along the coast of Asia, of Eastern Asia, from Southeastern Asia into Eastern Asia. And then people moved up into Northeastern Asia, and sometimes, a very controversial date, between 15 and 35,000 years ago, spread from the Old World across what at that time was dry land because of lower sea levels, into the Americas, and up and down the length of the Americas. And in the time since then, of course, humans have spread almost everywhere in the world where it's possible to live, including some places where it seems as if it would be very difficult to eke out a living in those areas. So according to the genetic evidence, the main physical differences that we see in humans today developed during this expansion out of Africa. Take skin color, for instance. The people who came out of Africa and replaced the Neanderthals in Europe probably had dark skin, because dark skin offers many advantages in equatorial climates like those where anatomically modern humans evolved. But people with dark skin have a disadvantage in more northern climates. Even today, if people with very dark skin are living in far northern climates and don't get enough vitamin D in their diets, they can be at increased risk for rickets because our bodies make vitamin D when our skin is exposed to the sun, and dark skin blocks off too much of the sun's energy. Here's a photograph of a little girl with rickets. You can see what a debilitating disease this would be for an individual or a group that was relying on hunting and gathering to survive. But say that one of the women among this group of modern humans moving north from Europe into Africa, from Africa into Europe, had a genetic mutation that made her skin lighter. So a woman with that mutation would be less likely to develop rickets, and so would her children, who would inherit that mutation and her lighter skin. And according to the laws of natural selection, this trait would eventually increase in frequency over the generations, as people with light skin leave more offspring than people with dark skin. So over time, the skin of populations moving north from equatorial regions would lighten. And you see that happening in different parts of the world. The same thing is happening in Eastern Asia, as people from Southeastern Asia moved along the course of moved north into Asia and began living in places with less sunlight. So you develop a situation like this, where people have different skin colors depending on what part of the world their ancestors are from. So sometimes I'm asked, and I was certainly asked in the course of writing this book, if people can develop different skin colors, a logical question is why they can't develop other kind of differences. Well, why couldn't one group be more aggressive, or more religious, or more intelligent than another group? But there's a couple of major problems with that kind of argument. First of all, skin color is determined by just a handful of genes, just 3 or 4 genes altogether. And it's not really influenced by our experience as much as you're growing up. Our skin is where our bodies meet the environment, and you would expect skin color to change as a result of the strong selective pressures that human beings have encountered in different parts of the world. And that certainly is what appears to have happened over the course of human history. So really the reason we have these different appearances is because of human beings are so restless. We expanded out of Africa very quickly into very different parts of the world with very different climate. And our skin color changed to accommodate those expansions. But complex traits, so traits like intelligence or athletic ability, are influenced by hundreds or thousands of genes and depend critically on the experiences that a person has as a person is growing up. And no biologist that I talked to had ever identified a selective mechanism that could sort these kinds of complex traits out among groups that are so closely related genetically. As I showed at the beginning of talks, human beings we share most of our genetic variation and have these very small genetic differences between groups. Really, given our genetic history, you would expect all groups to have about the same range of these complex attributes. I mean, skin color is very easy to change, but intelligence, these complex traits, are very difficult to change. What I concluded in this book is that after looking at that data that I showed you earlier, that efforts to find these kinds of behavioral differences in human groups, I don't think are ever going to succeed. Human beings are so similar genetically, and we know that the environment and the personal experiences that an individual has a huge influence on that person's traits. So the sort of the range of behaviors that can be generated by these experiences are always going to exceed these small genetic differences that you have between groups. So I think it's always going to be very difficult, but really I think it's going to be impossible to demonstrate that complex traits are sorted in this fashion between groups. Now you might hear otherwise in the next few years as scientists begin to explore some of the genetic differences between human groups. You might see stories in the news that how this group differs from another group for genetic reasons, but now that I've spent some time in this field, my advice would sort of be not to take those stories very seriously. There have been claims like this made for a long, long time, for hundreds of years really, and every time anyone has looked at these claims more carefully, they find that these traits are much more complicated than they appear to be when they're first investigated. The message emerging from our genome is not that human groups have these major genetic differences. The message is really just the opposite. Human beings are much more closely related than we tend to think. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to look at this relatedness in a different way. I've been doing so far is working from the past toward the present. So I've been starting at that point 200,000 years ago when modern humans like ourselves appeared and began spreading out into the rest of the world and formed the groups that we do today. But there's another way to look at this issue, and that's to look from the present back toward the past. So we can work our way back through our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents and so on, and figure out where each of us came from. So that's the second kind of story that I'm going to tell you this evening. These are also stories that come from our DNA, so I'm going to look a bit more closely at the source of these stories. Here are the 23 pairs of chromosomes that can be found inside the cells of a human male. So for each of these pairs of chromosomes, one comes from that individual's mother, and the other one comes from that individual's father. And you'll see that all of these pairs of chromosomes are the same size and shape, with one exception. Let's see if I can draw this down here. No, we'll do it again. And it's down here in the corner. There it is. Those guys down there. So that's how we know that this individual is a male, because this individual has an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. So the X chromosome comes from this person's mother, and the Y chromosome comes from this person's father. If the sperm that fertilized this egg had an X chromosome rather than a Y chromosome, this person would have been a female. But in this case, it had this Y chromosome, which made this the offspring a son. So let's talk a little bit about this Y chromosome. You know, as far as chromosomes go, the Y really should suffer from a massive inferiority complex. It's the only chromosome that's not essential to life because women don't have one. They have two X's. So you can certainly survive very well without it. I mean, about the only thing that a Y chromosome can do is it can take an embryo and make it into a male. In fact, the Y chromosome over many millions of years has engaged in this process that geneticists call rot. It's one of the smallest chromosomes, as you can see from this diagram, and also is the one that's sort of filled with the largest streams of genetic blather. It doesn't really say all that much. But you know, men have a tendency to overcompensate, so I suspect that if you met a Y chromosome someday walking down the street, he'd be quite proud of his manly appearance. Here's a map. Maybe some of you have seen this before, a famous map of the Y chromosome made by a graduate student with too much time on his or her hand. Can you read all this? So there's the gene that actually makes the embryo into a male, the TDF. But then there's gadgetry, channel flipping, catching and throwing. I like this one. Self-confidence, VLZ2. Note, unlinked to ability. Ability to remember and tell jokes, sports page, and so on and so forth. All those male traits that we know had to come from somewhere. So we should think about this Y chromosome a little bit more deeply. Here's a genealogy of my family going back 5 generations. So here I am at the bottom. I got my Y chromosome from my father, Frank Olsen, who got his from his father, Harry Olsen, John Olsen, Håkan Olsen, and that's where my Y chromosome jumps back into Europe, because Håkan Olsen immigrated to this country in 1865. So in each generation, this Y chromosome gets passed down from father to son, essentially intact. It's the only chromosome for which that's the case. The other ones get all scrambled up in the process of reproduction, but the Y is separate and distinct. It's sort of like a family heirloom that fathers give to each one of their sons. Now, this diagram assumes that in my lineage there was no occurrence of what geneticists kind of delicately call non-paternity. And that's not always a safe assumption. When geneticists do studies in hospitals, genetic studies, they're often incidentally able to determine whether the father listed on that child's birth certificate is the biological father of that child. And what they typically find is that these rates of non-paternity are 5 to 10%. They're much higher than you would expect. And non-paternity in a genealogical diagram like this doesn't always arise for reasons of illegitimacy. If you go back in any family, including my family, You find children who are adopted by relatives when both of their parents die. And that's an easy way for a Y chromosome to get inserted into a genealogical tree that is not necessarily the one that would be expected from biologically when you draw the tree out like this. So now we're going to come to a very important point about genealogies that isn't always obvious, but it's an important point for the rest of my talk. And that's that as you go back in time, the genealogies of individuals always overlap. And here's how this works. If I pick any man in this room, and I say, okay, I'm going to follow my Y chromosome back in time, and you follow your Y chromosome back in time. So what these dots represent is sort of generations of men beginning at the present and going back into the past. What we find is that our Y chromosomes are going to stay separate, but at some point, we are going to find an individual. We're going to find a single individual, the lower red dot in this diagram, who gave both of us our Y chromosomes. That is, he is the common ancestor for our Y chromosomes along the male line. If I were writing my book of my rules of ancestry, this would be rule 1, that these genealogies converge. In fact, it's a mathematical certainty that this is going to happen. There's no way around it. But the really interesting question is sort of when, where, and why this man gave both of us our Y chromosome. In other words, his Y chromosome came down to both of us. And this works for more than 2 males. So I can pick 3 males in this room. And I can say, okay, let's all follow our Y chromosome back in time. And eventually, we will find a single male who gave all 3 of us our Y chromosome. And in fact, it works for every male on the entire planet. You can say, okay, every male living right now, let's all of us follow our Y chromosomes back to our fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers back in time. And we're going to find one man who gave us, all of us, our Y chromosomes. And we know that that man lived about 60,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago maybe, in Eastern Africa. He's often called the Adam of the Y chromosome. He's related to mitochondrial Eve, the woman you might have heard about in this context as well. Mitochondrial Eve works by going back to the female line. The Adam of the Y chromosome works by following all of these Y chromosomes back in time. Now, there were lots of other men living at the same time as this Adam of the Y chromosome, from whom all the men in this room and all over the world, we all got our Y chromosomes from him. But all of the Y chromosomes of the other men living at that time had gone extinct. We got other parts of DNA from those men, but we all got our Y chromosome from that one man. So this is kind of a complicated idea to get used to, but I think it makes a little bit more sense when you start telling some stories about how this works. So let me move on to one of those. So the first story I'm going to tell comes from the Bible, and it concerns Aaron, who was Moses' older brother. Aaron was often Moses' spokesman, since Moses was thought to have suffered from stuttering. Here's a famous picture of Aaron and Moses, famous illustration, appearing before the Pharaoh, where Moses tells Aaron to throw down his staff, and it changes into a serpent. In Exodus, God tells Moses that Aaron and all of Aaron's male descendants, his male heirs, are from thenceforth to be the high priests of the Israelites. So only they could perform certain rituals within the temple, such as the offering of sacrifices. Aaron had 4 sons with his wife Elisheba, so all of his sons would have had his Y chromosome. And the sons of Aaron themselves had sons. So here's the situation of a Y chromosome getting passed down through the generations. And at the same time, these sons were all supposed to be the leaders of the priesthood for the Israelites. And even today, men who count themselves among the direct male descendants of Aaron still have special responsibilities in many synagogues, such as leading certain blessings. Within Judaism, these men are known as the Kohanim, which is the Hebrew word for priests. And many have a last name of Cohen or a very similar sounding name to that. Now, because these men are supposed to be the direct male descendants of Aaron, they should all have his Y chromosome. So about 10 years ago, in the middle of the 1990s, a group of geneticists who I've discovered are like the world's most curious people, they decided that they were going to go out and try to find Aaron's Y chromosome. So they sampled cells from using cheek swabs of about 200 Jewish males from Israel and North America and England. And here's what they found. This shows the Y chromosomes of the Cohen. And about half of the men they sampled had a very broad assortment of what I've labeled here, a wide variety of Y chromosomes. So these are the ones on the right-hand side here. But about half of the Cohen had Y chromosomes that were identical or very similar. And those are the ones in red here on the other side of the diagram. So they call this genetic pattern, the red ones, the Cohen modal haplotype, with modal in this case means the most common. And they found this pattern only among the Cohen. When they looked at other Jewish males, all of the males had this wide variety of chromosomes, no one of which was particularly common. So when you see this kind of pattern, you know that the men shown in the red part of this pie diagram shared a very recent male ancestor. Because they all have Y chromosomes so similar that it had to come from one individual in the relatively recent past. And there's a very interesting trick you can play with these data. I said that these men have similar Y chromosomes, not identical. I mean, if they all came from the same man, you'd say, well, why aren't all the Y chromosomes identical? But what happens is that when a father passes his Y chromosome on to his son, usually it's identical. Like my son probably has exactly the same Y chromosome I have. All 60 million base pairs are probably the same. But every few generations, a change gets introduced, a mutation. You know, you might have one of those 60 million might be different, or you might have a little snippet of DNA that gets added or deleted. And so these mutations in your Y act like this sort of ticking clock. And you can measure how long ago this common ancestor lived by looking at how similar the Y chromosomes are in this diagram. And what you found, what the geneticists found when they did this study, is that this common ancestor of all of these males, the half of the Cohen with this very similar Y chromosome, would have lived about 106 generations ago, which within the margins of error, this calculation falls almost precisely at the time when Aaron would have lived. So you can come up with other explanations for why this Y chromosome might be so common among the Cohen. You could say, well, you know, maybe at some time in the past, a particular man gained power and made sure that his sons became the priests of the Israelites. But really, you know, those kinds of explanations are much more complicated than the one in the Bible. Well, I think the biblical explanation is the most historically parsimonious one, that a person like Aaron or someone exactly like him truly did exist. And we can still see evidence of that today. So say your last name is Cohen, and you really want to know if you are a direct male descendant of Aaron. Well, you can take a cheek swab from inside your mouth and send it away to a genetic testing company, and for $200 or $300, they'll send you a certificate that looks somewhat like this, and it'll tell you whether you're descended from Aaron or not. But if anyone were to ask me whether they should have this test done, I'd say absolutely not. I mean, the odds are 50-50. Really, so you might as well flip a coin and save yourself the $200 or $300. And you know, this is really a case where you should assume what it is you want to assume, because what you don't know in genetics can't hurt you. So it's often a best. There are many people who've written about the negative experiences they've had with genetic testing, where the test results didn't correspond with what they might have wished. Furthermore, I can guarantee you that every single person in this room is descended from Aaron. No matter what your skin color or no matter what your ancestry is, we are all descendants of Aaron. Not through the direct male line. If you were a descendant of Aaron through the direct male line, you'd have his Y chromosome. But Aaron is on our family trees. So let me talk a little bit about that, how that works. Here's my family tree again, but this time I've extended it back 10 generations. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about some of the interesting things about this family tree. Now, of course, I'm using myself, but any of you could draw a family tree just exactly like this. So 5 generations ago, back in Ole Henriksen's generation, I had 32 ancestors. So that was in about the year 1850. And one interesting thing I realized, just actually in drawing this slide for this talk, is that I know Ole's name because somebody has done a heck of a lot of work on the male lineage in my family. I know very few of the other names 5 generations ago, despite the fact that there's been a fair amount of genealogical work done in my family. I know the names of 4 other people of those 32, and I'll never know the names. I'll never know who the other 27 people are. So then if I go back 5 more generations, so to Eric Henriksen's generation, he lived in about the year 1700, I have 1,024 ancestors, as do all of you. This is about 300 years ago. And I know Eric Henriksen's name. I know the name of 2 other people from 3 centuries ago, and the other 1,021, no idea. I'll never know who those people are 10 generations ago. Now, here's something really interesting. Think about one of my ancestors 300 years ago. So Eric Henriksen here, the person from whom I probably got my Y chromosome. He's no different than me. So 300 years before 1700, he also had 1,024 ancestors, as did all the rest of my ancestors 10 generations ago. So that means that 600 years ago, in about the year 1400, I had 1,048,576 ancestors, as did all of you. Actually, I think I know the name of one of those ancestors too, but I don't know the name of the other 1 million odd ancestors. And you can keep playing this game for a long time. 10 generations before that, so in the year 1100, during the Dark Ages in Europe, I would have had more than 1 billion ancestors. There's more than 1 billion slots on my family tree. Now, there's a problem with this calculation because there weren't 1 billion people living on the planet 900 years ago. So something very interesting happens between about 1400 AD and 1100 AD. The number of my ancestors and the number of the ancestors of everyone living in this room becomes larger than the number of people living in the parts of the world where our ancestors came from. So, because my ancestry is largely, though probably not completely European, in the year 1300 AD, my ancestors probably included the vast majority of the people living in Europe at that time. But you know, the other interesting question I asked myself when I was drawing this diagram is, how many of these ancestors actually lived in Europe? Well, I don't know, because I don't know who these people are. But I do know something about Eric Henriksen here. So actually, he's one person that I do know from 10 generations ago. I know that Eric Henriksen migrated from Finland to Norway in about the year 1700. Now, Finland's a very interesting country. We know from genetic data that there have been constant exchanges across the north of Asia into Finland. They don't even speak an Indo-European language in Finland. There's clear evidence of genetic contacts with people who lived in northern Asia. So I'm sure that 20 generations ago, through Eric Henriksen here, I must have had northern Asian ancestors. And we also know that there's been plenty of exchange between northern Asia and eastern Asia. I'm relatively confident that 30 generations ago, I probably have Chinese ancestors through Eric Henriksen, through that particular lineage of my family tree. But you know, I can do that with every single one of my grandparents. Edna Heidergott, German. So I certainly have Asian ancestors through that line, either Asian traders who would come to the medieval trade fairs in Germany, or if you go to Europe and talk to people from France and Germany, they often say, "Oh, I'm descended from Attila the Hun." It's quite likely that there is a little that there would be Asian ancestors from the invasion of the Huns into Europe in the year 400 AD. Edna Heidergott married Gordon Taylor, English. Certainly, between about 1500 and 1650, there was lots of African immigration into Europe. Africans varied in the population. Certainly, some of those people must be considered among my ancestors today. So my genealogies would extend back into Africa in about the year 1500. Jeanette Siggins, who married Harry Olsen, Irish. I'm sure I have Spanish ancestors who swam ashore after the Spanish Armada crashed off the coast of Ireland at that time. And you know, you can really do that for anyone of my family tree, but you can really do that for anyone's family tree. It works, these kinds of arguments work for individuals anywhere in the world. There's always a sufficient flow of people from one place to another to tie these networks of genealogy together so that your ancestry branches out from a single part of the world really through the entire world. So here's a little bit different way of thinking about this issue. I told you my first rule of genealogy would be that ancestries converge. So let's forget about Y chromosomes for a second and think about all of our genealogies. So what I've done here is I've taken two genealogical trees that go back 10 generations. They happen to be two males here, but it could be a male and a female or two females. It could really be anything. I've superimposed those two family trees. And I've asked this question. I've said, who is the first person on our family trees who is on both of our family trees? Who is our most recent common ancestor? Mathematically, we know that that person is always going to exist. And in fact, it can be demonstrated, as I'll say in a minute, that that person probably existed in a much more recent past than any of us would guess. So in this case, I've just shown by a yellow circle here, a person who is on both the family trees of these two randomly chosen individuals. By the way, I hadn't realized until I was drawing up this diagram that this is a measure of how closely these two people are related as cousins. Cousins have a common ancestor as a grandparent, and cousins once removed have a great-grandparent as a common ancestor. So these two individuals would be cousins, seven times removed, something like that. Now the other interesting thing, you can just as with the Y chromosome, you can do this for 3 people, or you can do it for 4 people, or you can do it for everybody in this room. I could say if we drew the family trees of everybody in this room, or everybody in the whole world, we could ask the question, who is the first person who is on all of our family trees? We could call that person the most recent common ancestor of all living humans. So, oddly enough, this issue had never been looked at very carefully. I discussed it briefly in my book and had some ideas about the way that you might solve this problem, but I just published a paper in Nature with 2 co-authors about 3 or 4 months ago where we looked into the mathematics of this situation and tried to figure out who that person was, who the most recent common ancestor of all living humans might be. And what we found, we did this 2 different ways, so we have a lot of confidence in the result, is that the most recent common ancestor, the person on the family trees of all persons living today, would have lived about 2,500 years ago. Probably in Southeast Asia, because from there your lineages of descent can quickly spread out to encompass the whole world. We know that this person existed and that he would have to be on these family trees. And we know that these networks of ancestry sort of link up with each other in the very recent past. That's why I can say that Aaron would be on the family tree of everyone in this room today. I mean, that's a certainty. So in our paper, we use these models that we built to make another calculation, and this calculation produces an even more counterintuitive result. Nobody can ever believe this when I tell them this is the case. So here's a graph that shows that result. What it's showing is that the bottom of this graph, where this red light hits the bottom, that's the most recent common ancestor. That's the first person who's on the family trees of everyone living today. And then we ask the question, according to this model, okay, let's go back in time from that person. Well, as you go back in time from, say, about 500 BC, when this person might have lived, you find more and more of the world's population is a common ancestor of everyone living today, until in about the year 1500 BC, you find that everyone living on the planet who left descendants, who has any descendants living today, is a common ancestor of everyone living today. In other words, ancestry sort of saturates at that point. And all of us are descended from all of the people who left descendants in the year 1500. Now, this is a very strange result. Very strange. It means that 3,500 years ago, my ancestors included not only all the Europeans who have ancestors living today, but all the Chinese, all the Africans, all the Australian Aborigines, all the Native Americans living at that time. Now, it doesn't mean that I got my DNA in equal proportions from those groups. In my case, most of the DNA in my cells right now would have been in the cells of Europeans living 3,500 years ago, and that's because of the sort of weighting of my ancestry. However, I'm still descended, as are all of you, from those people from everyone we left descended 3,500 years ago. And if we're descended from them, that means we have a chance. It may be a very small chance, but we have some chance of inheriting DNA from them. So if you went and got your DNA tested, and it came back with some very strange result, that if I went and tested my Y chromosome, and it turned out to be one more characteristic of Australian Aborigines, I would just be one of those rare fluke cases where my Australian Aborigine ancestors happen to pass that piece of DNA down to me. Now, I should also point out that this works going forward in time. So if my children have children, and then they have great-grandchildren, and so on, within a few thousand years, I'll be the ancestor of everyone living on the planet. As will all of you, whose children go on to have children. So what this diagram shows is, here's me, that's me, or any one of you who has children, sort of suspended in the present. It shows that in 1500 BC, everyone living in the world was our ancestor, and maybe 2,000, 3,000 years from now, it's a little hard to calculate exactly when this situation will occur, everyone in the world is going to be descended from each one of us. So we'll really be the ancestor of the entire human race at that point, as will all of us living in this room. Now, when I first realized this fact, as far as I can tell, I was the first person to sort of figure out the mathematics of this while I was writing this book, Mapping Human History. Really had a powerful influence on me. It reminded me of something I'd read a long time before. When I just got out of college, I was hiking up in the Shenandoah Mountains one time, and I was reading the book Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse about the founder of Buddhism. And I still remember taking a lunch break up on a high ridge, and I was reading toward the end of that book, and I read a passage that always stuck with me, and that came to mind when I was first thinking about these ideas. Siddhartha was having a conversation with a childhood friend named Govinda, and Govinda asked the Buddha how he had achieved such peace in his life, and Siddhartha told his friend to kiss him on the forehead. And when he did, Govinda had this vision. The way Hess described it is this way. He said, Govinda no longer saw the face of his friend Siddhartha. Instead, he saw other faces, many faces, a long series, a continuous stream of faces, hundreds, thousands, which all came and disappeared, and yet all seemed to be there at the same time, which all continually changed and renewed themselves, and which were all yet Siddhartha. So this is the vision that modern genetics is providing us with as well. It's revealed that people are distinct. We're genetically different. All of us have different DNA, but we're sort of bound together by these webs of genealogical and genetic interconnections. The way I wrote it in the last line of my book is, I said, we are members of a single human family, the products of genetic necessity and chance, born ceaselessly into an unknown future. I want to thank Montclair for inviting me to this talk, and Margaret Sokol in particular, and the Montclair Adult School, which I understand is here. It's been a great pleasure to spend the afternoon here and get to talk with people. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.